each of these reasons have different neural circuits that will unleash anger and aggression in response to specific triggers. I could give some examples, but I'm going on too much, I think.
No, but tell us about which bits of the brain are affected then.
Well, the brain's threat detection mechanism involves a huge part of the brain. We're not aware of how much information processing is going on unconsciously. So all of our senses feed into the brain's threat detection center, to the amygdala. Every sense, in fact, feeds into your threat detection mechanism before it goes to your conscious mind, before it goes to your cerebral cortex. So you can rapidly respond to a threat. For example, if a football comes into your peripheral vision, you will dodge and raise your hands and move out of the way. Very complex motor response within a split second before you've even seen the ball. And in fact, what's happened is that visual input goes to the threat detection mechanism of your brain, activates that, and motivates you to respond aggressively to that threat before the information even goes to your cerebral cortex so that you can form an image. Now, that happens with all our senses. So another example that will cause anger, if a woman or a parent's child is threatened, she will instantly respond aggressively and be angry to protect her child. We know that, the mama bear response, and there's no thought involved in that. In experimental animals, we can see these different circuits using new techniques, and you can disable the circuit that causes maternal aggression, the mama bear response, and the mother will no longer protect her pups, but she will still respond to another threat, for example, self-defense. And there are 9 such circuits that will feed into the attack region of the brain.
So tell us briefly what the 9 are.
I've coined the mnemonic life morts because just to get around the jargon, the scientific jargon, and also so that you can remember them, life morts. So I'll just quickly go through. L is life or limb. That's what we just discussed, protecting self-defense. I is insult. F is for family. That's the maternal aggression. E is environment. You will protect your environment with violence if necessary. If somebody comes into your house, for example. M is mate. A lot of anger and aggression has to do with obtaining mates and competing for mates in the animal world as well as in the human world. O is for order in society. Human beings are totally dependent upon our social structure. And the way that we maintain our social structure is through violence, same as other animals. We use codified violence in terms of the legal system, taking away people's liberties and rights. But still, we will be angry if somebody cuts in line and violates social rules. R is resources. If somebody snatches your wallet, you'll be angry and respond aggressively. T is tribe. Human beings are very tribal. An encounter with another strange group was always a threat. And we have the circuitry in our brain that within 170 milliseconds of seeing a person, we categorize them into us versus them and quickly form tribes. And the last is stopped. Any animal who is restrained will engage in violence, get angry, gnaw its paw off to escape a trap, and so will a human being. So the trick is to recognize all of these different circuits, the triggers for aggression, in the varieties that they are encountered in the modern world. We still have these circuits.
So, Chip, give me your response to this. Does this fit in with the way you see this, given all the research you've done?
Some does, and some doesn't. I would certainly agree with Doug about the circuitry part. And it goes back to, I think, Tiffany's earlier comment that, there's different types of anger reactions. And so if Doug is talking about those sort of quick snap reactions that often involve an aggressive response, that really makes sense. And that is a problem area for some people. But if you look at just the descriptive research, one of the big myths out there is that anger and aggression go together. And that when people think of the term anger, the next word that pops into their head is aggression. But if you actually start counting and ask people how many times they get angry and what they get angry about and what do they do, a different picture comes into focus. And there's a handful of these descriptive studies. There's about 7, 8, or 9 of them. And the thing that's the least common on everybody's list is physical aggression, meaning that we get angry very frequently, but very rarely do we act out by destroying property, assaulting people, pushing them down. That would be true for me. It would be true for you and everyone on the panel, because if it wasn't, you wouldn't be sitting in this elevated environment today. You'd be in a more controlled setting.
We'd all be shouting at each other, possibly.
You'd be in jail or psychiatric hospital, probably.
Well, I don't think it's a confusion. They're two different things. Anger is to prepare you for aggression. The purpose of anger is to prepare you to fight.
But as Tiffany, you were saying earlier, pointing out that this word anger covers with it a subset of all sorts of different things. And certainly you can have sort of cold anger, can't you? And resentment, I think you talked about that. You're a research fellow at the Centre for the History of Emotions at Queen Mary University of London. And in your recent book of human emotions, you describe the many different nuances that can hide under this umbrella.
Yeah, I think, just to go back to that point that I think, we can talk about lots of different kinds of anger. One question that I was sort of dying to ask you, Doug, was which bit do you think is where do you think the emotion is in that pattern that you described? There's a 19th century psychologist called William James. I'm sure you're familiar with him, and he has this idea that we habitually think that we have an emotion and that causes us to do something. So, you see a bear, you're walking in the forest, you see a bear, you feel frightened, and then that fear causes you to run away. And he says, actually, I think this is all wrong. And actually what happens is you're walking through the forest, you see a bear, you run, and as you're running, because you're running, you feel frightened. So he sort of sees the emotion, what he calls the emotion, as a sort of byproduct, or I think he calls it the epiphenomenon of these kind of physiological knee-jerk kind of reactions of the sorts of things that you were talking about. And I just wondered, maybe neither of those patterns are quite what you think an emotion is and where you think it sits with these physiological responses, but because I do wonder that if there is an issue generally in how we all talk about emotions, because we don't quite agree on what an emotion is. So I was quite interested in where you think the emotion of anger comes in the sequence of events that you're talking about.
The emotion is the noise of the engine. It's the mechanism. It accompanies the process. So let me give you an example. There's neurocircuitry that monitors the level of glucose in our blood constantly. This is all unconscious because if we were constantly aware of this and monitoring all the bodily functions consciously, our conscious mind would be overwhelmed. So when glucose drops, this brain circuit communicates that to our awareness with an emotion that we call hunger. And then that motivates us to go eat. It's not the emotion now that's driving anything. You can use various techniques to suppress that emotion of hunger, and it'll help, but you're not actually going to solve the problem until you raise glucose in your blood. And we have multicolored emotions because, there are so many kinds of threats and so many situations that your unconscious mind is communicating. And when I interviewed various people who, we talk about, trusting your gut. When I interviewed Secret Service agents, SEAL Team 6, they developed this. Another example, today I walked out, I felt of my home, I felt like I was forgetting something. I went through the list, I wasn't forgetting anything. I drove a mile down the road and realized I left my lunch at home. That's because your conscious mind can't hold all this information in consciousness. But my unconscious mind knew, totally knew. And it was communicating that information to me with this queasy emotion of anxiety, you're forgetting something. And so I think that that's what emotion is. It's your unconscious mind communicating to your conscious mind.
Doug,
I'm kind of wondering where the role of learning and culture kind of fits into emotion and expressions of emotion.
Well, the threat detection circuitry in the brain is modulated by input from the prefrontal cortex and can be controlled. I interviewed a number of people who are completely nonviolent, Jains in Indian religion and Quakers, and they are able to control the response to all these triggers of violence. It has tremendous consequences, though.
Tiffany, what are your thoughts on this? Because you're here to keep in mind the long view of the way different people have thought about anger through the ages. I mean, what we're hearing from Doug is very much a 21st century view, isn't it? Informed by all we know about the brain now, about new understandings of evolutionary principles and so on. But this must be very different from the way this was looked at 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Or maybe not.
Maybe not. Yes, maybe not. I mean, certainly 2,000 years ago, you can look at Seneca, who was a Roman Stoic philosopher who lived in the 1st century CE. He was fascinated by his own anger and desperate to kind of control it. And he wrote, well, he didn't write Why We Snap, but he did write a whole treatise of anger, De Ira. And it was all about trying to understand, so a similar impulse, trying to understand exactly the mechanisms through which he was going to get angry, in order to then to be able to recognise them, so that when he did feel these first stirrings or these first